Welcome back to Drive Your Thoughts podcast. I'm your host, Master Coach Carrie Marshall, and it's time to go after those goals.
Yeah, whether ready or not, life's coming hard, no breaks, no stop. And if you put me on the spot, don't get it twisted, I never drop. If you feel a bit out of control and out the box, here's a way that you could drive your thoughts. Turn this podcast on, it's a lock. Carrie Marshall on the clock.
Hey everybody, I am so excited to be here on the podcast with you today. We have some really fun topics to talk about. And so what I want to do today is I want to kind of walk you through a year in review. So right now in my business, what I'm doing with a lot of my clients is we're doing the yearly review, which is where we really walk through the year and talk about what went well, where the obstacles were, where they maybe have gotten their own way, and of course, really a ton of emphasis on celebration and seeing those unexpected surprises that came up as they went through the goal this year. So I don't know when you're going to be listening to this. You know, sometimes we drop podcasts at different times, and then sometimes you come to the podcast at different areas. So the first thing that I want to mention is that you can do a yearly review at any time. Most of the time we think about ending the year in December, but always remember that even if it's June, you can do a yearly review. You're just going to go from June to June. So that's the first thing that we want to remember. So I have amazing clients that I've been coaching for the entire year. And so we start to do this review at the beginning of December because we want to, number one, be able to make those celebrations really fun. But number two is we want to be able to actually see where we can accelerate some of the things that they're doing and maybe get some results in the last couple of weeks of December. So I love to do yearly reviews right after Thanksgiving and then that first week of December. So once again, remember that you can do this at any time. But the first thing that we talk about is what went well. So when you're looking at your year, I want you to really think about what went well with your goal. Where did you have those successes that you thought you were going to have? So for instance, I had one of my clients that launched a program for the very first time, and she had a goal to hit about 600 people in the membership. She did that. And so that was one of the things that when we were looking at her goal, we were able to kind of look at it and say, yes, like that did happen for you. It was an expected win. And so we like to go through expected wins first because we want to be able to see what tracked well when we were starting to go through the goal itself. So first off, do those expected wins. What went well? The second thing that I want you to look at is obstacles that you went through. So this could be with the goal itself, but it could also maybe be some personal things that you went through. That is the one thing that I always know we're going to expect, but the details of the obstacles we could never foresee into the future. Obstacles are something that sometimes we like to kind of look at and say, well, this and this could go wrong. But it's so insane because most of the time those obstacles are going to hit at different times than we expected, and they're going to look a little bit different than we thought they were. And so the reason that we want to look at the obstacles in our year in review is because we really want to see if there's any patterns that are coming up with obstacles. So let me give you my own personal example. I started to do this process for myself several years ago, and I noticed that something interesting happened all the time around Christmas, New Year's. I would really start to feel depressed. And so I started to notice that with my business, if I wasn't on top of my seasonal depression, number one, actually going and getting a diagnosis was really helpful for that. But number two is I saw that this obstacle happened. Here's the crazy thing. When I didn't have that and I wasn't tracking it and seeing where my obstacles were, I really just thought I was being lazy in December. That's kind of what came up for me. And so when I started to actually track it and say like, yeah, for the past 3 Decembers, I've really struggled, or the past 3 seasons, past 3 winters. And so that was really key for me to see. So we all have these obstacles, and so we want to start to see a couple of things. One time, my client saw that she continued to have struggles in this one obstacle, and it was triggered by one thing happening every single time. She would go out and she would launch something, and then she wouldn't get the response back within the next 48 hours, and then she'd pull back. And then she'd create all of this drama for herself, and the obstacle would be created. So she launched several products this past year. And so as we looked at every single launch, we looked at the data in there, and she was like, yeah, it's interesting that after the 48 hours, it plummeted, but then we rallied, and that was the hardest part. And so we started to see that the obstacles were actually being created not just by circumstances, but also by her thoughts and beliefs, and then the actions that she was taking. And so when we look at the obstacles that you're facing from the past year, we also want to be able to say, what could we do in the future to help with that? So maybe we don't have to go through it again. Now, there's some things that you might not be able to foresee, or maybe it comes out of nowhere. So for instance, one of my clients had his wife pass away this last year. That's not something that is going to be foreseeable. It wasn't something that he could plan for with this certain circumstance. And so we have to remember that sometimes those obstacles are going to come, and they're not going to be able to be planned or processed through, but we also just want to be able to put those into perspective. So the third thing that I love to talk about is we want to really talk about the surprising wins that we had. So these are the things that maybe came up as things that were really fun for you that you weren't expecting to happen as you went after this goal. So for instance, one of my clients was going after a particular goal that had nothing to do with publishing a book. And through the process of doing this, she was actually reached out to by a publication house and a literary agent. And now she has a book deal. Such an incredible win that she was not actually looking for, but it came because of the actions that she was taking and the beliefs that she had driving those actions. And so when you're looking at your own review of the year, I want you to really think about those surprising wins that you had, and then kind of look and journal about what made it surprising? Where do I see that win going in the future? What could I do to continue to have these surprising wins that might stack up time and time again? So the one thing that I want to offer is that sometimes here I like to talk about those big things that happen, but there's also these smaller wins and the smaller obstacles and the smaller surprises that come into play, and those can stack up over time too. So whenever you're doing your yearly review, remember that it's not just about the big, but it's also about seeing the consistent small as well. So for instance, another client wanted to start a podcast this year. So excited for her. And as she started to reach out and ask people to be guests on her podcast, she started to have these small wins. Now, she had some bigger names that she wanted to reach out to, but she knew that she was going to need a bigger following. She was going to need a better social media presence. So she kind of knew a little bit of how to play the game. And so when we were starting to look at those small wins stacked up over time, it was fascinating to see how far she had come. She still has quite a ways to go, but it was awesome to be able to see that there were actual steps and strides made this year, that if she continues on that same path or accelerates it next year, it's really going to make a difference in her life. So when we're talking about their yearly review, I really want you to think about why these small things are going to make a difference. I always like to say that it doesn't matter if it's an obstacle or a win, both are going to make an impact in your life. So for instance, if we take something else, I had another client that was continuing to put off making this freebie that she really wanted to. And there were all of these different reasons why she wasn't doing it. But month after month, she continued to put this one task off for a variety of reasons. So when we got to the end year review and we were looking at deliverables that she was able to have, there was this big gap in what we had written down, and it was this freebie. And so I asked her, I said, what do you think would have happened if you would have created that first freebie way back in April when we were talking about it? And so we kind of talked about that. She said, well, I know that I would have not only had the freebie done, which would have been a deliverable that I could always have, now in my content library. But then she was also talking about how she would have had data if it was working or not from April to November. Could you imagine? Once again, we would have been able to see if it was working really well. We would have been able to see if there needed to be a pivot. We would have been able to even maybe make a different freebie if that one wasn't working. And so she was talking about how every single time that she put it off, it felt small. She's like, it didn't feel like a big loss or like I was totally failing. She's like, it felt annoying. It felt like a to-do, a task. And she's like, and I just didn't want to do it. Like I always was getting caught up doing other things. And so when we're doing a year review, this is one of the reasons that we want to be really authentic and honest with ourselves so that we can see these small little changes that maybe could have made a really big impact in our life. So another thing that we always look at is what are you consistently doing that's paying off in your life? So one of my clients was really invested this last year in creating memories and relationships with his kids and his wife. And so when we were talking about this, now he's an executive, he's a CEO of a multi-million-dollar sports brand. And so he's been really busy this past several years since the pandemic hit. But when we were talking about these small, consistent wins with his family, he was talking about how sometimes it felt really frustrating because he would be in the middle of launching a new product or having to go to these and do expos and things like that. And he was like, yeah, it kept feeling like this big goal of mine was almost pulling me away from work. And so he said, I had to remember that it wasn't the big things that were going to make such a huge impact, but it was the small, consistent things. Because he said what he really wanted to do was shift and just say like, well, I'll go all in with my business, which is what he's been doing for several years. And, then go and take my kids on this really amazing trip. But as we looked at the year-end review, and he told me I can share this with you all, he got really teary-eyed. And I said, what's coming up for you? What's going on? And he said, it's not the fact that I take my kids to Europe for Christmas. He said, it's the fact that my daughter looks forward to me tucking her in every night and telling me about her day that means the most to me. And he said, if I wouldn't have had those consistent wins of telling my family that I would be there at 9 o'clock every night, whether I had to go back to the office or not, but that I would carve out time from 6 o'clock to 9 o'clock for my family. If I was in town, that was their time specifically. My phone was put away. And he said, and it was hard. And he said, and it was frustrating. And he said, and even people at work were sometimes getting annoyed with the fact that they couldn't get a hold of me from 6 to 9. So when we talk about these consistent small wins, that's why we want to make sure that we're doing this yearly review. Because when we looked back when my client and I looked back on it, he was more committed to now that 6 to 9 o'clock with his family than ever before. He was more committed doing date night once a week than he had ever been before. But he said that when he was in it, it was sometimes frustrating and annoying. And so as we kind of look at that, and we talked about the power of, doing these yearly reviews, because he said, I could see that I was getting, exhausted and kind of wanting to justify not doing it. And so he said, it was so great to, number one, have a coach that I was accountable to. I held him very accountable because that's what he asked for. And every week we would talk not about work at first, but I would always ask him, let's talk about your kids. Let's talk about your wife. How are your relationships going? How did date night go this week? How did bedtime go? And so it's just interesting that then from there, he was able to create this. So like I said, making those small commitments are really important. And then doing the review is going to be really important because then as we look at the next year, we can decide, how do I want to commit to the things that I'm really wanting to do for this next year? So whether it's continuing these really amazing habits that you've already set or setting out something else, we want to make sure that those really consistent small wins are going to make a difference. Okay, so let's kind of do a recap of what a year in review is going to look like. So what you're going to do is make sure to put your goal at the top of the paper. And then from there, you're going to make a list. You're going to do your big wins and your wins that you were hoping were going to come. You're also going to do your obstacles, and then we're going to put those in one spot. What were those obstacles and what did you face? Then we're going to put the unexpected wins that happened and maybe the small consistent wins that also happened at the same time. And then the last thing that we're going to write down is we're going to write down our failures. Now, this is just as important as our wins because we want to make sure that we're taking our failures and using them as feedback and then really adjusting and adapting really quickly. And so as we talk about you going and doing that review, make sure that you don't forget your failures. We want to make sure that you're writing down where did you fail? What did it feel like? What did you learn from it? Because those failures are going to be the catalyst for your next year. If we can really remember that failure is feedback, then what we can do is we can take it and actually use it for our next year. I'm really excited to get the next year started with you. We're going to talk about some really fun topics in 2023. I have some amazing guests lined up that I'm so excited for you all to hear from. And so if you are interested in learning more or having feedback into the podcast, I'd love for you to come and connect with me over at Instagram at Drive Your Thoughts Coaching. Tell me, what do you want to hear in 2023? And then remember that before the year ends, go ahead and do that year-end review. We'll catch you later. Bye. Thanks for listening to this podcast episode. If you're ready to get in the driver's seat of your own life, you can come and follow me at Drive Your Thoughts Coaching on Instagram, or come and see more ways to work with me at driveyourthoughts.com.
Yeah, whether ready or not, life's coming hard, no breaks, no stop. And if you put me on the spot, don't get it twisted, I never drop. If you feel a bit out of control and out the box, here's a way that you could drive your thoughts. Turn this podcast on, it's a lock. Carrie Marshall on the clock.